Tell me about synesthesia. What is it? Why does it interest you?
Yeah, synesthesia is an extraordinary way of experiencing the world. I don't have it myself, so for me, studying it is like studying a group of aliens, except they're not aliens. They're just people who are out there, and everybody knows somebody with synesthesia, even if you don't know exactly who they are or what they experience. So people with synesthesia have an extra experience tagged on to what people normally have. So for somebody with synesthesia, music isn't something you just hear. It might be something you hear, but also you see it as flashes of light, colored light, dancing shapes, textures, and so on. Or maybe as you're listening to my words now, maybe each word has its own taste in your mouth, or triggers like a ticker tape of colors across your visual field. So synesthesia is really an unusual way of experiencing the world. So everybody assumes that their way of experiencing the world is shared by everybody else, and it's only when you ask somebody what color is Tuesday or what does the word computer taste of that you realize, hang on, there are some weird and wonderful answers to those questions that you would never have thought about.
And you talked a bit there, like there's differences, and so you can say synesthesia as a broad term. This kind of mixing of senses, in that we don't normally think of as a color being having a taste. But then, so tell me about the range of different experiences. Why are there so many? How then should we characterize synesthesia if there is such a range of different experiences one can have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you might have somebody who have taste for words, and you might have somebody with colour for music. And then you think, well, these things are so different. Why would you give them the same terminology? How do you know it's the same thing? Well, actually, one of the reasons we know it's the same thing is that although you do get that kind of pattern that one person has this and one person has that, overall, if you have synesthesia, you're more likely to have lots of these different things. So some people literally have five, six, or even more types of very different kinds of synesthesia. And these things tend to co occur in these people or within their families. So you might have a mother who has taste for words, and then she has a daughter who has colors for numbers or experiences the calendar in some unusual way. So here it's not that the type of synesthesia has actually gone from mother to daughter or whatever. It's just a general way of having these unusual experiences, which suggests that again, synesthesia, although it is got all these different kinds, there is something that is meaningful to give it a common terminology, and that is probably a scientifically coherent concept, even though it is so varied.
So there is a kind of person that is more likely to have it, and then you said there as well, it can be passed through generations. So maybe even a kind of genetic aspect to it. So yeah, tell me a bit about then what other things are So a person has synesthesia, and what more can you say about them? Like on average, are they more likely to have certain personality traits or like other ways of thinking? Like tell me about people with synesthesia.
Yeah, exactly. So we define people with synesthesia by having these extra experiences. But actually, if we bring them into, say, a lab, or we give them a bunch of questionnaires, actually we find out that they're different across a whole range of things. Um, they're different in ways that are, I guess, somewhat subtle. So if you were to meet somebody with synesthesia, you might think, oh yeah, they're a bit like this, a bit like that. But you think, oh, it's just them. But actually, when you put 50 or 100 synesthetes together, they're all a bit them. And then, that is just so improbable that everybody with synesthesia would have a particular way of thinking or particular personality type. That's obviously to do with synesthesia and not just to do with them. So the kinds of things we're talking about here is in terms of personality. There's one particular trait that's called openness to experience, which is around imagination and creative thinking. So again, it might be that having synesthesia makes you think, makes you more open to unusual ideas, unusual experiences. That would be one plausible argument. But there are other things such as that they remember things in particular ways. So they remember things in sensory details and not just the synesthesia. So if you ask somebody with synesthesia to remember a childhood holiday, they would remember the actual perspective of being on the beach, and they would be able to rehear the sounds and so on. So it's not that they're having the extra sensations. The real sensations can be recalled as well in ways that are unusually vivid for them. So they have good and vivid memories. They're very good at detecting patterns in things. So this might be colors. So if you go to look at swatches of paint, you might find two shades of red that are very, very similar, and you look at them and think, I can't tell whether they're different or not. Somebody with synesthesia can do that. So it's almost like they've got finely tuned senses, which is puzzling. So if you imagine that, synesthesia might be full of things that they're bad at, but actually overall we find that they're quite good at a lot of things.
It's interesting that you bring up that they might actually have better memory than people in pattern recognition, because when I was like learning about your work, it actually made me think that synesthesia reminded me of memory techniques that you see in different cultures. Like associating certain images and things with a thing you want to remember, and then being able to say, memory palace, say trying to go through an experience you visualize to help aid with memory. And then that kind of makes me think one might want to be synesthetic or almost try and develop and cultivate this kind of ability in some ways. Like in some ways, there's some important way in which it's adaptive. So tell me a bit about that, like how it's actually in a way helpful sometimes. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Well, obviously, I think there are multiple ways in which it's helpful. So, one is, as you say, it's a different kind of style of thinking that makes you use your senses more to remember and to think, is the best way in which I can describe it. You might be able to use it specifically as certain kinds of mnemonic aids or tools. I'm thinking here about, for example, music. So, some people have said to me, if they're tuning a guitar, how do you know where middle C is? So for most people, that's you can't do it. You would need to play middle C on a keyboard or have something else. But for Synesthetes, they would know that middle C is a yellow shape that has a particular texture, so they can use that as a kind of a reference point to find this. Or similarly, if they're listening to music, they can see the pattern of the music. So as other people would memorize music, maybe in terms of the score, the way it's written as symbols on a piece of paper. They've got their own internal kind of score that is colourful and has shapes and so on, that for them can be a little bit like a mnemonic. So I think there are multiple ways. What is this general tendency to think and remember with the sense, and then there are other where you can use your synesthesia almost directly as like a memory aid.
I see. It's for example, that the middle C and trying to hear something incredibly specific and it's not something you kind of almost logically think through. Like whereas the middle C, you kind of if generally you need to just hear it and then okay you can replicate that. But it makes me think that like maybe part of what people with synesthesia are picking up on are these kind of they're trying to like constellate together irrelevant things that or things that you would think are irrelevant, but they're because it's kind of idiosyncratic, right? Maybe they have a certain color or something, some sort of feel of the note, and then that can help them understand and hear something they generally wouldn't be able to do. So that's really interesting that they are able to. I don't know. It makes me think about so in general this ability to pick up on patterns that are generally not there. I mean, is that something that can kind of be useful?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, to some extent, there are some kind of patterns that are there and people aren't aware of. So again, if we think of music, uh, high pitched notes being small and sharp and bright and things like this. So the synesthetes, although they are different from one person to the next, somebody might have that as pink and somebody as yellow. They do tend to pick up on these kinds of tendencies. They're sometimes called cross-modal correspondence. So this is something like, is a lemon fast or slow? There's no right or wrong answer, but most people think that they're probably fast. And again, syntheses are often kind of tuned to these things that other people have to think about. So for other people, they're kind of metaphorical. For a synesthete, they're kind of literal, I suppose. So there are these kind of associations that they pick up on. And then, as you say, yeah, there might be arbitrary things in the environment that maybe there are just a particular pattern that to everybody else is random. But if you're a synesthete, you notice that actually, that maybe there's you experience them as red, so it enables you to see actually that they're arranged in a particular way.
So you bring up that a lemon and you're saying it's fast, or there's the Bubakiki effect, right? And you name these certain shapes and yeah, it kind of it makes some intuitive sense, and there's a general tendency for people to name them in this way. But again, you can't really logically explain it. But I guess so. From that, I kind of want to ask, to what degree actually does this kind of synesthetic sort of ability actually just pervade cognition in general, in the sense of if you think about even reading texts, and things, or the way we when we speak, we use elocution and pitch and things to sort of add detail and clarity to the way we speak. And so people are constantly needing to pick up on these more implicit patterns that maybe don't necessarily carry some obviously logical thing to denote meaning. So is there a way in which the synesthetic sort of ability is related to cognition in general?
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, it comes back also to what you were saying about memory as well. That actually, yeah, other people could use these as kind of memory tools to use imagination and so on. I guess to some extent, synesthetes are doing this. Automatically, or that they don't have to think about things in a particular way because their brains are wired to think in that way. So that's the difference, whereas other people would have to train themselves or do something else to kind of maybe pick up on them. So I think that there is a bit of a fundamental difference in the sense that synesthetes don't have to go through that particular process. They already have detailed kind of visual maps and fine-tuned kind of sensors that pick up on these things, whereas for other people that they're having to go through that. But ultimately, yeah, all of our brains are there. They try to make associations between things. We can use our imagination. We can use things in particular ways. I suppose synesthetes are just kind of doing that because of the way that their brains are wired, and other people are doing it almost as a deliberate choice. And to me, yeah, you could say they're similar to me. They feel that it feels quite different.
Okay, okay. So there are some benefits to this, and to having synesthesia. I mean, what are the problems to it? Is it a weird thing in people's lives that they, if it's sort of involuntarily, as you say, it's not something where it's whereas someone might be able to sort of cultivate a skill in it. People with synesthesia seem to actually, it comes naturally and
Mm.
sort of built in with them. So what do they kind of face in their lives?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so obviously, so synesthesia, we don't know exactly when it develops. Some people say from infancy, but certainly in general, if you ask a synesthete, when did this happen? They're not going to give you a good answer to it. So as far as they're concerned, they've always had it. So this means that they don't know what it's like to not have synesthesia. So often when we get a concerned email, it's about a parent who doesn't have synesthesia who's discovered that their child has it. The child may or may not because they don't know what's going on anyway. They can't get out of their head to realize what not having synesthesia is. So there can be this kind of well-meaning worry about parents that actually it's odd. Certainly, having unusual experiences can be difficult. So, if you're in a culture that doesn't celebrate neurodiversity, they want everybody to be the same and think the same, then if you think or experience things differently, this could be seen in a bad light. So I think we're fortunate, at least in the UK, that we can kind of celebrate diversity. But obviously, when somebody discovers they have synesthesia, that initial discovery is that I'm the only person in the world who has this, unless they really do find a family member who has it. So they go through that kind of initial alienation, and then all of a sudden they discover actually, oh, it's a thing. There's a name for it, and then they kind of then become part of a group or a tribe or a subgroup or whatever you want to call it. And that can be kind of reassuring. So there are kind of social difficulties about navigating what it is to be different. About parents kind of misunderstanding that synesthesia must be overwhelming or problematic, or if a child has synesthesia and then they have some problem at school, the conclusion that's jumped to is they've got this problem at school because of their synesthesia. That might be true, it might not be true, and you can't, with one child and one parent, you can't do that. That's why you need science to actually say, is this generally true? Kids have all kinds of problems. Most people, when they go through school, have some kind of issue or problem. How do you know it's the synesthesia that's doing it? So we're trying to kind of unpick that. Certainly, some synesthetes do find it overwhelming. They say, "Oh, I wish I could turn it down or tone it down a little bit." But most people come to terms with it.
Mm. Like on that point, being kind of overwhelming. Um, I wonder what you think of you have put any thought into psychedelics and the fact that people will talk about having more synesthesia, in these experiences, and what does that tell us about synesthesia? What do you think of this?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I would love to know what the link is. I mean, I can see a kind of a pathway through science in which we could do that. So I've been collecting. the data from synesthetes who have an MRI scan. You can see how different brain regions talk to them. There are other people doing the same thing with psilocybin, which is in magic mushrooms. You can see how the brain is performing differently, and then you can kind of compare data sets and see how they're similar or different. And clearly there are key differences. So synesthetes have this throughout their life, and so on. It doesn't switch on and off with some chemical, but maybe they have differences in chemical receptors in the brain. So we know, for example, with psychedelics, which chemicals are affected in the brain. It's quite a simple thing. It's a particular receptor called 5-HT2A, and so but we don't know anything about the 5-HT2A receptor in synesthetes. When we've collected enough genes of people with synesthesia, we can look at that. So I'm kind of open that there will be a link. Clearly, there are differences, and that synesthetes have differences in the way their brain functions throughout their life, whereas for others, it's a chemical switch. There has to be differences in the story, but I can imagine a scenario in which there could also be, similarities too.
And so you mentioned that like it would be interesting to have more data on, say, the genetics and on the receptors there of people's brains, and then we could, because we talked about openness, say, in personality, and it would be really interesting to think about, what makes people more likely to have synesthesia, and even things like different kinds of synesthesia and what determines that. And so I wonder what your future work is kind of looking at. What kinds of things, maybe even beyond synesthesia, are you interested in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in general, I am, interested in why is it that one person's brain is wired differently from another. So everybody's brain is wired differently, but that doesn't tell us anything. The question is, why is there this group of several percent of the people who are wired like this? You know, the idea is that everybody's different, but actually maybe these differences are kind of structured differences, that there are particular types of people. So this whole neurodiversity movement is very interesting, but what is the structure of neurodiversity? If everybody's neurodiverse, and this is kind of a little bit meaningless, so it's kind of what is this? So to kind of understand this and make sense of it and understand the structure of this, and for me, synesthesia is part of that story, and it's an interesting part of the story because actually people are not going for the doctors looking for this. Yeah, often they want some kind of diagnosis in inverted commas for some validation, but it's quite different from, say, autism or ADHD, which has this medical background as well. So for me, I'm kind of I see synesthesia as a bit of a test case for how are our brains different from one person to the next? Why do they differ? What is the structure of this difference between people? And how many groups of differences are there? You can divide the world into people who have synesthesia, people who don't, but there must be other things as well. You've got autism, you've got ADHD. What is the Venn diagram of neurodiversity? What does it look like?
Mhm. What do you think of, in I've been thinking about how, say, when we taste food, and there's evidence that when we like smell and like the texture of the food, they all influence each other and give us a sense of what the thing is we're eating and like the experience of it, right? Like in general, we can't separate out any sensory experience because our brains are always trying to create a whole coherent picture. What does that? Do you think that is related to synesthesia? Like a synesthesia, something, uh, like added on to a typical way in which we always have to kind of collate senses together?
Yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. I mean, yeah, to some extent, you're always, our brain. One of the things our brains are doing is that it's given a small bit of information. It's trying to fill in the rest of the picture. That's what we do. We always have something that's ambiguous, or there's always more than what the eye sees or what the sense sees, and we're trying to kind of do that. To some extent, synesthetes are doing that by adding these kind of extra things on that nobody else sees. In effect, so that would be one way. Of thinking about this, that their brains kind of do that. The question is why they become quite fixed. Why, for a synesthete, if they think that A is red, why is it always red? And why don't you kind of unlearn that? And things like that are kind of more puzzling. Because it doesn't have to be red. It could be something else, and you could put pairs of synesthetes together, and they will disagree on that. So I think it's an interesting idea, but I can't quite see the end point with it. There are kind of flaws in the logic as to why it is. But in general, yeah, our brains are just trying to complete the picture, and they can never see the whole picture, but they see bits of it, and you're trying to fill in the rest. And some extent, synesthetes are doing that, but in a very particular way that is slightly unusual.
Hmm. At the start of the talk here, you talked about how you're studying this phenomenon, but you yourself don't have it, and so it's a weird thing to study, right? Like these people with completely different experiences to you. So, what other ways you try and visualize or think about what other people are experiencing, or like I imagine you had like VR or something. Maybe there's a way we can almost train scientists to help them understand what it's like to have synesthesia. I don't know. I'm just, this is a final sort of speculative question.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, it is something that a lot of artists kind of work with, either in some metaphorical or some literal way, that they try to reproduce their experiences to share them and kind of help people to understand them. I mean, and I've worked with artists with this, or I've had animators kind of where people describe or kind of sketch their experiences and had a professional animator try and reproduce that. Again, these are 2D, moving things. But yeah, people have tried similar things in VR as well. Yeah, for some synesthetes, their experiences are kind of literally outside of their body. Some people describe it as like an inner screen. So they say they've got, yeah, like a screen inside their head or behind their vision in which they see it. And that's not something you could do with VR, because you can't have a screen behind your eyes that you kind of see. It is so out there. But yeah, I think there's a lot of possibilities and ways of kind of making it real and concrete.
Well, that's on that. Where do you see the image in your perception? Is it sort of behind you, a kind of like vague, or is it like right, in your perception? That's something I talked with another cognitive scientist in New Zealand about. Is that we talked here about synesthesia, but just in general, beyond that, there's so many different ways in which cognition can kind of be different. So, so that's awesome. So this has been great. Where can people find your work? Is there any way you want to point them as we finish this?
Well, you can Google me, Jamie Ward, and Synesthesia, and you'll find various stuff. I've got a research website, but you'll find my work online.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack.